It's my privilege to say welcome to this ACI seminar. My name is Bo Thyssen, and I'm the founding partner in ACI. We are proud of the interest in this seminar and that you're spending time with us this afternoon. We also want to welcome all organizations from all over Europe, yes, actually all over the world. A couple of practicalities before we start. We run the full presentation without breaks. All participants are muted. A recording of the seminar will be shared after the seminar. We will have some exercises throughout the seminar, so please have a pen and paper ready maybe. And for questions, you ask in the QA. If this does not work for you, then please use the chat. All questions will be gathered and answered in writing after this seminar, and key questions are answered as we go. For those watching the recording, some features and animations may not be visible in the recording. Cyber threats and IT risks are increasing globally across industries. We all hear about IT incidents every day, and we want to protect our organizations the best way possible and in a way that comply to the regulation that we are subject to locally. However, we do find that not all the methods and models out there provide the consistent decision support that the organizations need today. We see organizations having invested heavily in risk management and security and still be hit by very big cyber events or incidents that cost the organization a fortune. When we backtest our models, if we dare to do that, we find that they did not predict risk well enough. So the question is it possible to develop a risk management framework that comply to regulation and at the same time provide the best decision support and forecasting? Yes, we in ACI believe that this is possible. ACI was founded in 2009 in Copenhagen, and today we are around 13 specialists working for clients in Europe who want to have better decision support based on proven methods. We deliver assessments for hundreds of risk scenarios every year and have quite a lot of practical experience. We deliver risk assessments for approximately 30% of the financial institutions in Denmark, and we are attracting more and more clients wanting to move in a more quantitative and empiric direction. We are developing sophisticated quantitative tools, enabling our clients to do a what-if analysis with more than 10,000 simulations in less than a second. We are happy to share our experience in this seminar, and we are also very happy to see more companies moving in this direction. We will also be happy to share our experience and know-how with our service providers out there working in this field. So just reach out, even though you consider yourself as being some kind of competitor to us. We will invite to seminars like this in the future, so please click the follow button on our ACI LinkedIn profile. So we are going to invite you all to more seminars, also with specific training in some of the practices that we will talk about today. So please stay tuned. Here's the agenda for the seminar. We have 4 risk specialists that will take you through the agenda, and each speaker will give the word to the following speaker. So we will We are in the introduction area right now, and then my colleague Spence will talk about why quantitative methods outperform qualitative methods. Then we will dig down into some how-to. How can we make quantitative risk assessment? How can we use Monte Carlo simulation? How can we build good risk scenarios? And how can we reduce uncertainty with measurements? We will also look at how to estimate the likelihood of a cyber attack and how to estimate the impact of a cyber attack using the FAIR ontology. And then we will have some question and answers in the end. We are going to discuss models for risk management in this session. And before we do that, we have to remind ourselves that all models are wrong. That's why they are models, right? They are built with the knowledge available at the time they were built. We also, and that's right, why we also talk about model risk and the model resolution. The map on the left has a resolution that is sufficient to tell the country, but probably not the resolution sufficient to build a new bridge in Denmark, right? The model on the right is a good example of a wrong model, but a very useful model. It was announced in 2019 by IBM. It is a very high resolution and the first hourly updating weather model that is able to predict something as small as thunderstorms virtually anywhere on the planet. So this was just the necessary disclaimers. All models are wrong. We are looking for useful ones. Well, risk management is an old trade. The Hammurabi Code of Laws was a collection of nearly 300 rules that established standards for commercial interactions. It included early versions of risk management when it regulated damages and compensations from, for instance, plundering bandits. In the 90s, the major consulting firms introduced early versions of risk communication tools like the risk matrices and simple ranking methods. Since 2015, we have seen quantitative models used for predicting especially cyber events. It has also got its own three-letter abbreviation, CRQ, Cyber Risk Quantification. Insurance companies apply quantitative methods for covering cyber. In ACI, we believe that this wave will keep building. And in the future, we see progress in the quantum computing will lead to leaps in the performance of especially these Monte Carlo simulations. Let the best man win. Organizations with the best risk models and the right leadership will make better decisions in an environment with uncertainty. And better decisions lead to better results, and good results lead to winners. So we believe that at the end of the day, everybody should measure their risk model on how good it is to deliver decision support for management. My apology for a slide with too much information here, but before we start, we just need to have some definitions in place. If you place yourself in an airplane, it's reassuring that it's built with common definitions of things like speed, gravity, angle, temperature, weight, etc. For risk management, however, it's not always the case. So let's just agree on some basic definitions. Let's agree on the term risk, the probable frequency and probable magnitude of a future loss. What is risk management? It's a coordinated activities to direct and control an organizations with regard to risk. What is a residual risk? It's risk remaining after risk treatment. What is the inherent risk? It's an assessed level of raw or untreated risk. What is a scenario? It's a clear expression of a threat event with an asset, a threat type, and an effect. What's a vulnerability? It's a weakness of an asset. What's an asset? It's something of a value. What's a risk register? It's a repository for all risks identified and includes additional information about each risk. What's a threat event? It's an event where the threat actor acts in a manner that has the potential to cause loss, but it first becomes a loss event when a threat event has or will cause loss. So let me just test you. If you just look at these terms here, can you place them in the right category? You could just get not 2 minutes because I'm already behind schedule, but you'll get 30 seconds. I hope that you can get a full 100% correct test here. Okay, I hope you got them right. What is an APT group? It's a threat actor. A file share with 100,000 sensitive documents. It's considered an asset. Cybercrime with a financial motive using various attack techniques. It's a threat. Insufficient patch level on a Citrix environment. Is that a risk? No, it's a vulnerability. Lost confidentiality and availability, that's a consequence of an event. And the phishing mail deleted by a mail filter, that's a threat event. But when it's reaching an employee who clicks on the link and activates some kind of malicious software, that becomes a loss event. I have covered the introduction, and I will now give the word to Spence. Take the floor, Spence.
Thank you very much, Bo. What I want to talk about in this chapter is sort of how a lot of the ways we do risk assessments and risk analysis today in IT has some built-in flaws, which I think a lot of us are aware of. It might be hard to think about sort of where can we go to address some of them, but I'll just briefly address what some of these flaws are and how much they actually mean for the output of your risk assessment or your risk analysis. So first of all, I want to talk about two major sort of categories of flaws. There's the flaws associated with the actual risk model and the mathematics used in many of these basic risk assessments. And then there is a lot of psychological bias and also bias in the methods we use that have a tendency to color the way we understand and interpret risk a lot as well. And what we see when we are out consulting, we generally see that a lot of these biases are not really accommodated very well because it might be tedious or it might be extra work. And why should we do that? We can just put in a number and that'll be fine. But as we'll see throughout here, is some of these biases actually have a tendency to impact the risk assessment to an extent where the effect of the model is higher than the effect of the actual risks in the model. Then you can discuss whether this model is useful or not. So just for starters here, Bo just mentioned it briefly about risk. We interpret risk as a probable likelihood and a probable impact of some kind of loss event. So risk equals likelihood times impact. There are different ways to look at this also. If we start with a sort of basic risk matrix, we tend to see these a lot. There's a one axis, the y-axis here, which is the likelihood of an impact occurring, and the x-axis indicating the impact of this incident. So this was originally a tool used to communicate risk. However, today it's also to a large extent being used to analyze risk as a tool in and of itself, which comes with quite a few problems. And I want to address two of the problems associated with the risk matrix here now. One of them is the ambiguity of the text we usually apply to each of these cells. And the other major issue is what we call range compression, and I'll get back to what this means. So one challenge we often meet from people who might not be all that well versed in quantitative risk assessments is, well, we cannot sort of boil down our risk to just one number. That would be irresponsible of us because there's uncertainty about risk. So what I want to show you, and what I know my colleagues will also discuss today, is we don't intend on boiling down your risk to one number. We don't believe that's possible either. What we want to do is add quantitative values to the uncertainty we have about potential future outcomes. So what the solution to this sort of uncertain future has been with these models tend to be that applying ambiguous terms to the cells like low, medium, high have been sort of the first solution, because then it's up to the interpretation of the individual what they want to apply, and that's problem solved. And we'll see how and why it's not. Because what we do now, we add some probabilities here. We say it can range from a highly likely event to a highly unlikely event, and the consequences can range from very low to very high. This is verbal scales. You will meet quite a few places when you start looking for them. What is problematic about this is that we are adding in a new source of error to a risk assessment. And this is a source of error which is not inherent sort of to the expert input, but it is how they are asked to respond. So you can have an expert who have a good idea about where the impact might land, but the way we ask them the question actually produces worse answers than gut feeling would have done. So if you look at the term probable, try to think for yourself just quickly. If an event is probable, this is number 4 on the scale here. If you want to give me a percentage of this event occurring in a year, if it's probable within the coming year that we have such an event, what kind of percentage would you put down on your piece of paper now? And do you think we can do this in a consistent way across, now we are some 60, 70 participants on this meeting? People have actually studied this, and the conclusion is a very large no, we cannot. I will show you now a picture from one of these studies that have been done. And what you see is this term probable. Estimates range from something like 25% likely within the coming year to 90% likely within the coming year. If you have an incident and somebody says, well, the risk level is high and we suspect it's probable. Now if you haven't done any other work, you technically cannot be sure if this person has meant, well, it's something that happens once in every 4 years, it might be something that we almost see every year. And to us, that's quite a big level of uncertainty, which is not expressed explicitly in this model. So one way, again, people have decided, okay, we need to address this ambiguity. We can see this as a problem. Low, medium, high is not good enough for us. We need to add some numbers to this. So then you add numbers to each of the columns and each of the rows in order to sort of assist the respondent in how to answer. And we see also often, some of you might also not that you've seen them too, that sometimes one column of numbers applied to the matrix is not enough. So you start having 3 or 4 different columns to estimate different elements that might contribute to likelihood, or the same with the consequence. You have the the GDPR risk in one consequence row and another one which is financial risk and so on. If we just take a simple example, and these numbers, they are sort of extrapolated from ISO 27005, the most recent one. This is not a bad example we've plucked out of the bunch. This is actually one of the more sane examples we've seen. So if we take these values now, because the issue is now we add values, we also assume that it's possible to do some kind of mathematics on this model here. So if we now just define 4 risk scenarios, we have one risk scenario, which is highly likely, and the consequence is rated as normal. I will show you in a moment where they sort of show up here. We can do a calculation on an annual loss expectancy, and we are removing some of the math here, but in basic sense, we just multiply the likelihood or the probability of the event occurring by a selected number within this range that is in the cell here, 1,000 to 10,000 euros. So we do this for all of these risks, and what you'll start to see now is we have a risk scenario which is number 3. It has an annual loss expectancy of 100,000 euros. This is 7 times higher than the annual loss expectancy of scenario 4, which is a yellow risk. So you have a green risk, which is 7 times more impactful on average than your yellow risk is. And turns out this is not a standalone issue. This is not just a number I plucked out of here to say this is the issue. We encounter this range compression. So we take a very wide range of potential outcomes, and we try to plop them into a few boxes. And we make the assumption that our risk can only be placed in one box. And this is generally not true. Most of the risks we have looked at, they range much wider than just one box. So trying to place it into a box, again, goes back to the point where we add error unnecessarily to the interpretation of the expert judgment, for example. So also one thing I want you to note about this model is that a cyber attack that would be less likely than 10% in a given year. So if you look to highly unlikely, it's 0 to 1 event per year. Such an attack could never be higher than green. It could never produce a yellow risk, no matter how big the impact of such a cyber event would be. Now, if you're a sufficiently small organization, that it is very possible that your risk of a cyber attack within the coming year is less than 10%. So a cyber attack would never figure in your list of red or yellow risks to your board of directors. We've seen some people work around this by saying, well, then we have sort of 5 key risks that we report on no matter where the risk level lies. But again, that's, in our opinion, it's a way of working around your actual models to show an accurate picture of risk. And then you can discuss, well, if we need to work around our models to be accurate about our risk, maybe there's an issue with our models. So another way to illustrate this challenge would be if you show it in a graph. And I have a graph here, which is of the exact same table, showing from where to where the different boxes. So each of these boxes are reflected in one column. The green columns, the yellow columns, and the red columns. And you see the 4 risks we talked about before. Now, what you'll see is actually that the green risk can be as expensive, the number 3, as the risk scenario number 1, which is a red risk. And even worse than that, this model is based on a logarithmic scale on the x-axis, on the cost axis, which basically just compresses the range of potential losses. So if I wanted to show you how these losses would look in a non-logarithmic model, this is what you get. And if you zoom in on the very leftmost millimeter of this graph, this is what you get. I hope this is a clear enough picture to you of once you start adding numbers to your risk matrix, you don't solve any issue. Rather, you just add another issue of challenging basic mathematics, which these matrices are not suited for. And you start adding error to a level where there have been studies showing examples of these matrices, the way they've been constructed, actually add more risk or more uncertainty, more error to your risk assessment than a pure gut feeling, write a sentence on what you expect this risk is, dear Mr. and Mrs. Expert, and then present that. So this is what we want to address in terms of the model and mathematics. Then there's some human errors, and I won't go into detail too much about these right now, but we have looked at this calculator, you could say, and we've seen for qualitative methods that this has substantial built-in flaws. The next big challenge is the people using the calculator, so the people who actually provide input. And multiple studies into probability and psychology in general have shown that we humans are very, very bad at estimating and working with uncertainty and probability. So if we just take one example for now, that would be overconfidence and lack of consistency. It's basically two examples, but they're associated. So when experts over time deliver estimates on a risk assessment, it's shown that they are incredibly inconsistent over time. So very small changes in the actual sort of risk profile and or in whether this person has had a bad day or not can make quite big differences in where they place their X in the matrix. Then the second part is the overconfidence. We humans are very good at being confident in our own estimations. And this means that if I just went into a discussion and I thought sort of what is the coastline length of Norway, and I say, oh yeah, that's, I don't know, 12,000 kilometers, just to give a guess. If I'm asked to provide a range, I could probably also provide a range from some thousand kilometers to, I don't know, 50,000 kilometers. But studies have shown that if I'm not actually trained in providing estimates with a range, I'm too confident in my own answers, and I will be wrong much more likely than if I actually train for this. And there are ways to train for this, and Frederik will briefly touch on some of these also. So my point about this is just there are quite a few biases and psychological challenges we face when collecting risk information from experts or from systems. And we need to address this systematically in our risk assessment technique or methods, whether we do it qualitatively or quantitatively, because they have a major impact on the risk we are able to communicate afterwards. All right. I will skip past this. This will be a slide you can have a look at in the recording and ask your own risk assessments, how well you feel you are confident in what you're doing with your own methods right now. It's basically trying to ask the hard questions of your risk assessment techniques. Do they actually provide the value you are looking for? Does it provide the guidance you need on how to prioritize your limited resources? Now have a look in the recording for this after the webinar. What we want to do with our risk assessments is to achieve accuracy with a useful amount of precision. Now, what do I mean by this? This is being inaccurate and imprecise. I'm not hitting the board, and I'm basically not hitting in the same area either. Now, what risk matrices tend to be is inaccurate but very precise. This is the one of the challenges of the range compression. If I have to be very precise within a certain box that this is where my risk is, and how the world works is just that risks rarely conform to these boxes. So you will be very precise. You can provide one number or one box, but it's most of the time it will be outside of the actual sort of target. Now, what we want to do, first of all, is to be accurate. Now, being accurate doesn't help much if you say it's anywhere between 1 million and 1, because then the uncertainty is not really useful in sort of decision making. But our primary goal is to start being accurate first, so provide estimates that cover the potential outcomes we expect to see, and then try to achieve precision within a certain level of accuracy. And this is a method that allows us to work statistically much more confidently with the estimates we are being provided, whether they are from systems or from people along the way. So how does this sort of pan out? It pans out in, we have this expert providing some input. Today, they provide the input directly to a matrix. They point on the matrix and say, my risk is medium and it's probable. And then you can provide this map for your board of directors saying, oh, we have 2 red over here in this rightmost column. We have 4 down in the green, and we have 1 over in the yellow. So the way we do the risk assessments quantitatively is basically we take the same expert, we apply some techniques to calibrate their responses and to take into account this uncertainty and this bias there is in people's responses. Then rather than putting it right into a piece of paper, we put it through a simulation. And this is not a fancy platform somewhere exotic. It is basically just an Excel sheet. You can do this yourself in your own on your own computer in an Excel sheet today. Run 10,000 random years of these estimates, and we get outputs that explain the risk in a series of numbers. So our output is not one number, this is your risk, but it's a range of probabilities of experiencing a certain level of consequence over, for example, a year or whatever time period you're looking at. Now, to dive deeper into this, I will leave it over to my colleague Frederik, who is one of our quantitative experts, and he will take you along here.
There we go. Thank you very much, Spence, for this nice presentation. Until now, we have looked at what is wrong with the qualitative, you could say, the qualitative method, but we haven't yet digged really deep into what the quantitative is. Right now, you're looking at the slide and you're seeing some dices and some graphs and some numbers, and it all seems very threatening to your PTSD. What do I mean by PTSD? Post-traumatic statistics disorder, right? So I wanna try to break that down for you so that we don't cause any PTSD on this session. Let's look at the word quantitative for the at first. Comes from the Latin word quantus, how great something is, how much there is of something. And so the quantitative assessment, risk assessment, is the process of putting numbers to our risk in a very unambiguous way, meaning that we cannot misunderstand each other. What kind of language is the same no matter where when it comes to measuring the risk of something? Well, the risk of something bad happening, with some uncertainty. How do we measure something bad? Well, a good measure, a good unit, you could say, if you want to measure speed, that is kilometers per hour, right? But what is it for something bad happening? We tend to use the unit money, right? A monetary unit. What about probability? Well, probability is actually the unit that we use to measure uncertainty. So whenever I say the word likelihood or probability, just calm yourselves down and think of the word uncertain. That's your keyword. Whenever I say likelihood or probability, just think, oh, that has something to do with uncertainty. So for the quantitative model, already Spence has looked into these three boxes: the input, processing, and output. We are going to look at these boxes down here. We're going to see what are we actually doing in each one of those that are different from the qualitative model. So let's dig into it. How do we do it? We want to know. Tell us, how do we do it? We are going to look at some of these key points that are helping us to move towards accuracy with a useful amount of precision. That's where we want to be scattered around that bullseye. We don't necessarily want all of our bullets to land in the same area. We want to be scattered around the middle, right? So we want to have that accuracy with a useful amount of precision. I am going to be focusing in my part of this presentation most on the calibration, the expert calibration. How do we go about doing that? And also it's very tight connected to estimation with ranges. Then I'm going to be talking about the simulation. We're going to be drawing things on a whiteboard together, and it's going to be great fun. So hang in there, and please don't get PTSD from my presentation here, even though I studied mathematics. Okay, let's understand how we do that, those ranges and the calibration. Let me see here. Yes. In order to work with a range, we need to introduce the concept called confidence intervals, which is basically just a range where you have X amount of certainty of the right answer to fall within your range. A 90% confidence interval then is a range where you think you have a 90% chance of being right, meaning that the true answer to the question falls within your range, and a 10% chance of the true answer falling beside your range, right? Why is it beneficial to be able to account for uncertainty on a given range? Well, the wider the range, the smaller our uncertainty is that the right answer would be between our bounds, right? Take a point estimate as an alternative. How sure can I be that the thing that I'm measuring is presented well by a single number? There's a very high probability that that single number that I chose is not the right answer, right? Because I'm basically just tying in everything on one single point. Imagine now that you would have to come up with an estimate for my height. What do you know about me? Maybe some of you have seen me in person. It would be easier for you to estimate my height, but pick one number. If you don't know me, it's going to be more difficult, right? What would you be willing to bet $100 on this number that you're now thinking of in your head? Would you be willing to bet 10? No, probably not, right? Why wouldn't you be that? Why wouldn't you be confident in betting on a single number? Well, now pick a range, okay? Think of a range where you would be willing to bet €10 that my height falls inside your range. If my height falls into your range, you get 10. If it doesn't, you have to pay me 10. Okay? Think of a range where you would be willing to bet €1,000 on the right height being inside your range. So if it's not in your range, then you would pay me. Did you notice that there is a difference between the range where you would be willing to have the trade-off of €10 and 1,000? It's quite interesting, right? Before, You came up with a number, and you weren't able to come up with a number that you would be willing to bet a 10,000 or even 10 euros on. But now you have a range where you're actually willing to pay or to go into a bet of 10,000. You could say, well, I think you're between, I can see that you're standing up and there's a wall behind you. I can see the bottom of that wall. So you must be higher than a meter, right? You must be taller than a meter. And most humans are shorter than 2.5 meters. So that's going to be my range. Then you say, okay, but a range that big is so arbitrary that it's useless. Then I will ask you, how is your point estimate making that any better? Ignoring the uncertainty about a question is not the solution. How long is the Norwegian western coastline in kilometers? How much do you know about Norway's geography? Very little, you might say. In that case, your confidence interval would turn out to be very wide, since you have to be 90% confident, certain that the right answer is between your bounds. Consider now the difference between a 100% confidence interval and a 90. Let me see. Yes, this is, let's think that we come up with this 100% confidence interval. That's the blue interval that you see there. And our 90 is as follows. If you are a geographer specializing in the northern Norwegian coastline, your intervals might be a lot narrower. Why? Because you have more information. But let's just think that I don't know much about it. What's the difference then between the 90 and the 100? Well, we can see that I'm able to go a lot more narrow on the interval, right? Why is that? Because I'm leaving out a 10% chance that I might be wrong. Thereby, I can make it narrow, since I allow for that 10% chance of the right answer not being in my range. What is the right answer? Well, it turns out that Norway has the second longest coastline in the world after Canada, with a length of 100,915. What does this have to do with the risk management, you might think now? Well, imagine if you are to estimate the cost of some event, and you're asked to come up with an interval. And you think, hey, I've learned something about a confidence interval. Let's come up with a 90% confidence interval. Could you see how this knowledge about the underlying uncertainty about a matter could make you a better estimator? If you just come up with a range and you don't state your underlying uncertainty about that range, well, there's a lot of uncertainty there, right? We're not giving all the information that we could give. So now that you are, how do you actually become better at addressing that or assessing your own uncertainty? It turns out that you can be asked for a bunch of ranges on actually trivia questions. These type of questions that we just discussed. And if you do that in a short feedback loop, where you're asked to come up with these 90% confidence intervals, let's say for 20 or 30 questions, and you get, after each 10 questions, you get the feedback. How many of these were actually contained the right answer? That in itself is making you a better estimator about your underlying uncertainty. In our research, we found out that when people, they say they are 90% confident of something, like that some answer would fall into their range with a 90% chance, well, actually, they're only right, meaning that the right answer is between their in between their range 30 to 40% of the time. Think of that. So they thought, I'm giving these answers, and I'm 90% sure that the right answer is between those two bounds that I just mentioned. Amazingly, people, and it's all over across the board. Everyone, when they first start, it's only about 30 to 40% of these ranges that actually contain the right answer. So they were not 90% correct. They were actually 30 to 40% correct. Certain about the answer. And that's an interesting fact. So next time you say, I'm 100% sure, I'm a 90% sure about something, think back to this small exercise and think twice maybe. Now I am going to be coming back to this, and we're going to look at the simulation part. And it's going to be a very interesting time because we are going to be drawing together. So let me see if I can make my whiteboard work here. And I have pre-drawn some of the ideas here. Yeah, if you didn't get that, that's post-traumatic statistics disorder. Well, let's look at it. What do we have until now? Going to do like that. Right now, we have discussed some of these ranges. Right, we have a range. We have a lower and an upper bound, and there is some uncertainty about whether where we are going to fall in between this range. Now imagine that you have two spinners that are basically just spinning between a 0 and 1. So meaning the spinner can end, when you spin it, it can end on anything between 0 and 1. It might end up right here, first spin, it might end up there, second spin, and so on. Think of two spinners, one for probability for an event, and another one symbolizing the size of the loss. We are going to be discussing, keep in mind what we're doing. We're discussing Monte Carlo simulation, and what was that? It was the alternative to multiplying two numbers together in a risk matrix, right? So we're discussing how do we, if we don't just multiply the numbers in a risk matrix, how do we actually go about doing that in another way? And here I'm introducing these spinners as an example of these many trials that we're going to be using. We heard the word 10,000 trials, right? Or the term 10,000 trials. This is what we're talking about here. Imagine that you have an event where you know that there is a 5% chance for this event to occur, right? 5% chance. Well, how would that look on a spinner? Well, it would look like this. That every time the spinner lands in those 5%, then I would get an event. I would have an event. So on each spin, I'm gonna spin it, and I'm gonna ask the spinner, did you produce an event or not? That's how I'm able to do probability or work with uncertainty. I'm going to end up with 10,000 spins, and how many of those spins is going to be landing on the event? Well, 5% of them, right? If it's totally random, then 5% would land in that green area. If we do 10,000 spins, we would end up there 5% of the time. I hope that you follow me until now. Okay. Think now of the other side of the equation, right? We know that we have for risk, we have the probability times loss, right? Now we're okay. We understand this. How do we do that in a simulation? Well, we do a spinner. We ask it each time we spin. Did you cause an event? Did you not? That's okay. That's understandable. Now we're going to look at the loss side. The loss side becomes a little bit more, you could say, complex. So please follow me here. I'm going to be zooming out a little bit. Okay. Here we have a spinner again, but imagining now that you have a graph that is able to translate a number from 0 to 1 into a number in your range. How would that graph look? Well, it can look in a lot of different ways, but I drew one here. So let's try to spin the spinner together. First time we got 0.25, right? Where does that end up in my range? Well, that's around here, right? And that means that my first number that I'm going to pick is going to be in the lower end of my range. I'm going to do it again. I'm going to do it 10,000 times. So now you see that I'm going to be pick a lot of numbers from down here. And basically, I'm going to do the same. I'm going to write them down and I'm going to say, okay, how much did you cost, dear event, when you occurred? And then the nice trick comes now. The nice trick comes now. I'm going to do it 10,000 times. And now I have an equation here, 10,000 equations. And this is for each of the scenarios. So there is one scenario here, there's one here, there's one here. Let's just stick with one scenario. We know what a scenario is, right? One scenario here. Okay, what is the equation? How does it look for the first spin? Let's see. No event times, and let's say my number that I got from my range by my translation graph that I did. That was 15,000. Well, no event times 15,000 produces 0. All right. And imagining that happening all the way down here because it had a very 5%, so it's only going to produce an event 5% of the time. But imagining down here at number 25 trial, we actually have one event, a 1 times, and this time it was 125,000. Good. Try now in your mind just to populate this table all the way down with 3 different or 4 different scenarios. What are this making us able to do? Well, we are able to ask better questions now. We're able to ask questions like, what does my average loss look like for scenario 1, for scenario 1 and 2, for the whole portfolio of scenarios? And wait, what's the chance for me of losing more than X amount of money in a year? Well, that is basically just going back to this table and counting how many of the times where my events produced a number that was higher than whatever I want to know the answer about. And if you do this for all numbers, you can actually make what we call a loss exceedance graph. So here we have the percentage of the trials, the 10,000 trials that exceeded some amount, and the amount is down here, right? That's going to be my monetary value here. So in the beginning, when the loss is very low down here, maybe all of my scenarios, they exceeded 0. They were larger than 0. Okay. And as I go down into more and more expensive losses, I see that the probability of exceeding that loss is going to be smaller and smaller and smaller. So this was just a very quick introduction into what is Monte Carlo 101. What I would invite you to look further into is concepts like this translation that is called the inverse distribution, F inverse distribution. And there are lots of types. Right now, I just drew one that could be a normal distribution. You've heard about that, right? That's the bell curve. At log normal, that has a fatter tail. It has a skewed body and fatter tail. We have a bunch of distributions that we could throw out there to translate that spinner into actual loss. And each of them distribute the losses differently. So for some events, I might want to have a very fat tail, meaning that I have quite a big amount of probability for extreme events. Other types of distributions have maybe symmetric, meaning that there is an equal chance of getting something small, that there is getting something big. So that's all like it's all modifiable, you could say. let me go back to my presentation here. And I'm gonna take over again and just if I continue on the whiteboard, we would eventually be able. Oh, it disappeared there for me. Just a moment. If we went back to the whiteboard, we would eventually be able to make this cyber risk information sheet. You've seen that loss exceedance curve before, and now we're able to say things like, how does an average yearly loss from a cyber event look like? Now that's the number on the far left there, 1.2 million. What does it look in an extreme event? An extreme event in statistics means a 99.5 percentile, for example, fractile. So this is just to show you that we are able to get information that is way better from the quantitative method than we are by putting it into colors and risk matrices. So what have we learned? We have looked at something about ranges. We have some overconfidence, right? That we want to address. We want to be better at assessing our own uncertainty about something. And then we have looked into this method of using two spinners, spinning them 10,000 times, writing down the answers in a table, and basically ask questions like, what's the average? How many % of these trials was bigger than that and that number, and so on and so forth. By this, we're able to do things like mitigation. We can do what-if analysis. We can ask, if I were to implement this that would decrease my probability this much, how much would my yearly average loss be decreased? Or how much would my fractile out there in the end, like my extreme losses, how much would they be decreased by putting this mitigation into place? And that was what we looked at. So now I'm going to be giving the word to our next speaker, which is Bo, and he is going to be talking a little bit about. Can you change slide, Pata, or whoever is yes, building good risk scenarios. That's the next theme. So take it away, Bo.
Thank you, Frederick, for your very engaged presentation of this stuff that might raise some PSTD in us, but I think you made it look quite useful. What have we talked about so far? We have been talking about some basic definitions. You remember all the terms that we are using in the risk management world. We have looked at the flawed models, especially the heat map that has some built-in flaws that we should be aware of. Then we have talked about using ranges and calibrating our experts before we ask them anything. And then we have also talked about how to give simulations. And I noticed that Frederick in his presentation saying that we all know what scenarios is, right? So I'm not sure if we all know what a good scenario is, but we will talk about this now. It is the building block of a good risk assessment. That is to know what we are assessing. And a scenario is a verbal presentation of something bad that can happen. So it's a description of something bad that can happen that has a likelihood and has a loss. So how do we actually produce good scenarios, allowing our experts to actually estimate, like Frederick has just talked about? How do we do that? Well, it's actually very important that we has unambiguous scenarios. So this exercise, what is the risk of a worn out tire? My question to you guys is this a good risk scenario? Well, I think if I could read your thoughts, you would all say, well, Mr. Teigersen, it depends. Where does that worn out tire, where is that located? So is it a worn out tire here? Then the risk is one thing. If it's a worn out tire on a school bus filled with students on a slippery road like this, then it's another thing. So what is the risk of a worn out tire? That is a good example of an ambiguous risk scenario. Because when this is put to the table, this scenario, we would all say, well, Mr. Teigersen, it depends. And as long as we will say, well, it depends, we have some more work to do. So how do we create a good risk scenario? A good risk scenario has 4 components. It has a threat actor. It has a threat. It involves an asset. And it has a consequence. And if you think back to the introduction, each one of these elements has a clear definition. So let's pick an example here. Is this a good risk scenario, do you think? Try to look at it. Does it comply with the protocol that we just saw before here, that it had these 4 elements? Does it have these 4 elements? Well, let's look at it. Does it have an asset? Yes, it does, actually. There's a CRM system, and there's some client information involved in this risk scenario. So check, there is an asset. Is there a threat? Yes, there is actually a threat. There is a code exploration or brute force password guessing. That's a threat. Is there a threat actor? Yes, there is. It's the red one. It's a malicious external actor. And is there a description of the effect or the consequence of this incident? Yes, there is. It's a loss of confidentiality, integrity, or availability. So in this example, you have a good risk scenario that complies to the rule that we just discussed. It has these 4 elements. So if you go back to your risk registers that you are working on in your various organizations, then ask yourself if the risk actually comply to this very basic protocol involving these 4 elements. If it does not, then you're not able to ask the question to your experts on likelihood and on impact, because they will say it depends, and that will make that dialogue very, very difficult. So I think the next one was reducing uncertainty with data, and I think it's you, Mads. So take it away.
Thank you very much, Bo. I think we're now able to write a better risk scenario. So that was very nice. As you mentioned, I'm going to talk about reducing uncertainty of estimates by using measurements as well as observations. So data that'll give us a little less. It depends. So you're actually already doing this in IT as well as when driving down the road, or if you pilot an airplane, you collect measurements and observations which reduce your uncertainty. So you have MFA enforced. Okay, we know that this will reduce the probability of a loss event. You also have a segmented and filtered network that will reduce the potential loss of an event. Your SCADA system is accessible through VPN and multi-factor authentication, but only 16 hours yearly during 2 maintenance windows. Again, we reduce uncertainty with these measurements. So let's keep on going with Bo's example of the worn out tire. But let's ask, what can we measure to reduce the uncertainty of the risk? So if you'll bear with me, listen to these. The driver is inexperienced. The car is a new front-wheel drive Volvo. The road ahead is flat. It has 5 soft curves and 2 90-degree turns. The weather is relatively clear. There are no winds. The car has 2 equally worn front tires. The driver plans to go no faster than 40 kilometers an hour. The driver is 23. The driver is late for the final exams. The road underneath the ice is asphalt. So now we have a lot of measurements and observations, and we're able to reduce our uncertainty. But we're also approaching a saturation point where any additional measurements might not reduce our uncertainty in a meaningful way. So what if the driver is inexperienced, but he or she is planning to go only 40 kilometers an hour? So what does this tell us about the risk? Well, maybe at this point we would say it could go either way. Some observations and measurements are better than others. I look at the car and I see that all 4 wheels have snow chains mounted. Aha! This tells us something very specific about the risk with a high confidence level. Some of the other measurements seem rather irrelevant now. We would argue that with few measurements and observations, we are able to reduce the uncertainty of this until this saturation point, where any additional information is irrelevant. This means that we could save a lot of people a lot of time answering hundreds of difficult questions regarding security levels of their assets. Let me give you an example. Center for Internet Security is responsible for the sys controls, some call them sys 18, which you might be familiar with. They have identified 153 safeguards and spread them across these 18 controls. There is a lot of best practice, good ideas, and basic cyber hygiene in these sets of controls. They are ordered by importance, and you can group them according to your company size and type. I highly recommend using them. But you can't address them all first, and some might be irrelevant. The safeguard about protecting your Wi-Fi is irrelevant if you don't have Wi-Fi, but you still have to ask the question. So working with these sys controls and other frameworks and standards for that matter is a good idea, but as a whole, it doesn't necessarily give you the best input for your risk assessment. A real-world example from a large organization, they have 2,000 systems, all with a system owner. Information security requires them to evaluate the 153 sys safeguards for each system. Yes, some safeguards can be skipped if the system uses, for example, Active Directory, but it is still a full-time job answering these questions, as the company says. One of these safeguards from the sys controls reads, uninstall or disable unnecessary services on enterprise assets and software, such as an unused file sharing service, web application module, or service function. That's a mouthful. To me, this is sound advice, absolutely. but it is difficult for an asset owner to answer with a high confidence level. Does he answer yes, no, or 3 on a scale from 1 to 5? Or does he answer yes on 72% of assets? Either way, he's spending a lot of time answering these questions. And who determines what an unnecessary service is? Well, it's just a difficult question to answer. Will these answers be of high quality and help reduce the uncertainty? That's 153 questions times 2,000 systems. I think that might be a no. I have a question which is much easier to answer and describes the risk level very well. Is the asset internet facing? So maybe you're thinking, what should I measure? Penetration tests, disaster recovery tests, multi-factor authentication deployment, awareness tests. And you'd be right. These are examples that could be relevant measurements for you. You need to spend some time with your experts to figure out which handful of questions are easy to answer with a high confidence level that explicitly describe risk. Find the questions that are as good as, are there snow chains mounted? That will help you reduce the uncertainty of your estimates, lower bound, upper bound, or both. Now I would like to talk a little bit about one of my pet peeves, which is open source information, the things that you can measure, but probably don't. Your online threat surface is publicly available, obviously, but the scope might be broader than you think. This area covers more than open firewall ports and web servers. It also includes the home address of your CEO, which other companies your chairman of the board is affiliated with, and the name, email, and phone number of the student helper in accounting. Open source information must be understood, reduced as much as possible, and monitored. And measured, of course. Attackers use open source information to get to know your company and your employees. So putting together small bits of details about internal workings in your company to form a story that can convince Lisa in HR to click a link in an email, that's probably easier and faster than breaching your next-gen Palo Alto firewall. You can measure open source information and use it in your risk assessment to reduce uncertainty. For example, measure how many Word documents you have published on your website. Or even better, you can measure how many Word documents contain metadata with the host name of your print server and the file share where the document is stored. This is internal information that does not need to be shared. It's probably shared inadvertently, and that's why you need to map and understand your attack surface. It is bigger than you think. We also see many companies oversharing on their websites. We've seen examples of detailed software manuals with screenshots and technical documents about APIs for financial services. This is a treasure trove for attackers. They can get to know your internal jargon, your product names, and typical support issues. Imagine what an attacker can do with the guide on how to reset passwords of the software your company develops, complete with screenshots and username of the person who created the guide. So, to summarize, you need to measure fewer important properties of an asset than you think. Measurements must be easy to answer for the right people. And they must tell us something very specific about risk with a high confidence level. Enough about that. Frederik will now talk to you about how you can estimate the likelihood for cyber attacks. And I think Frederik's already ready. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Mads. I enjoyed that very much. We're going to be talking about the estimation of probability, and we are going to use some of the concepts that Mads he described, the measurements that is reducing our uncertainty. I'm going to split it into two parts. I'm going to be looking at estimating probability for events that have known occurred events before internally in the company. We have a history of those kinds of incidents. How do we come about measuring probability of those kinds of incidents? And what about the times where we do not have any known history internally in our company? How do we go about measuring probabilities for those kinds of events? So that is what we are going to talk about. Let's just look at this nice guy, Pierre-Simon Laplace, a very mathematician who thought a lot about how to express the probability by using prior information. So the idea is basically, don't look too much at the red box yet. That'll be for your reference and later on. The idea is basically, if you don't have any clue about whether an event will happen or not, your ultimate initial state of uncertainty is 50%. Right? You don't have any history. You don't know anything about it. How likely is that event to happen if you don't have seen any history and you don't have years of experience? Well, 50% is the best estimate that we can come up. That's your estimate. Now a year has passed and you don't see any event. You haven't seen it. It hasn't occurred. Now think of a fraction, right? 50% as a fraction is 1 and underneath 2. Now 1 year has passed, and what Laplace he found out that when you have prior information, meaning a year has passed and it didn't happen, that's information to me. That's a measurement. Well, we can add 1 to the denominator and 0 to the numerator. What does that give you? Well, now it says 1/3, right? So that's my new estimate. If I was completely uncertain about the event first year, my second year, I can now say that at least it's less than 50% now. This way of doing probabilities assumes that you don't have any inevitable event coming your way. Like you could not use it, for example, to calculate the probability of your death, because then you would say that the probability is getting lower and lower and lower the older you get, right? But for things like cyberattacks, which is more of a happy-go-lucky or internal errors, the foundation of this equation is solid. Let's take an example of an event. An expert, he has 5 years of history in the company, and he remembers 3 specific scenarios happening. He remembered that specific scenario happening 3 times, right? So there is incident data for the scenario that we're testing. It was a scenario that was well framed, and we have 3 incidents of this scenario on a period of 5 years. What's the probability of this event happening next year? Well, we learned that we start with an initial probability of 50%, and then we add to the numerator, we add 3, and then to the denominator, we add 5. This gives us 57% probability. So that's a pretty nice handy tool, right? If someone asks you, what's the probability? What's the best guess? Well, use Laplace rule of succession. What about working with probabilities for scenarios where we don't have any history? Here, I just want to quickly draw your attention to industry data. The 2 examples, there are more reports out there, but the 2 that we have used and are using is the DBRIR by Verizon and the IRIS by Scientia Institute. There are listed some pros and some cons here. Like they have a high amount of incident data. There's so much data gathered. It's done by Advisen, which is a distributor or a supplier of information and statistics for many insurance companies. And it can give you probabilities for specific attacks. You can go in, you can look at your sector, your business area. Where are you in pharmaceuticals, or are you in the public sector? And it actually is able to give you probabilities for specific types of attacks. The cons on these reports is that the loss data, the monetary values that we have, is extremely big, because there's a large number of these incidents that go unreported, meaning that eventually it in these report ends up the ones that became known, and a lot of those that were much cheaper, well, they weren't reported, so we don't have data for them, so they don't contribute to a lower average. Probabilities can also be hard to fit to your organizations. Sometimes we come up with the probability by reading the reports. We say, well, it's a 10% chance for a cyber attack, and then we would, if we had 10 clients that all had that 10% chance, then it would be highly unlikely that we go 3 years without a single event on each one of these 10 clients, right? But that is the case sometimes. So sometimes you have to use common sense and not just take a number from these reports, but think about the context of how they are written, and so on. How do I have a challenge. I have an extreme big amount of business areas, each with their own systems. And how do I go about measuring the probabilities for all these different systems? I have so many different systems, and can I compare them in some easy way? Well, yes, you can. There is a very not, I wouldn't call it easy, but there is a way to do this that in the hands of the people who are estimating becomes very easy. So building it is one thing, but using it is another thing. The horizontal line is where we base our initial probability. It could be from industry data, it could be from internal incident data that we have. And now imagine that you have some traits on your systems, or a bundle of systems, that make the probability either greater or smaller based on the state of that trait or that characteristics. We call these traits risk factors. And it turns out that for cyber, there's only, like Massey, these are measurements, we could say, that we could turn on our systems that could be used to say something about the probability. In our projects, we have seen that that at some point, just like Massey said, we don't get exceeding value by increasing the number of measurements. So we came down to things like type of logging, which is a measurement we can do for our systems. We can measure things like patch level, monitoring. What's the monitoring process that we have on this specific system, and what is the authentication that we are using on these systems. These 4 measurements each have different states, right? That could be yes or no questions that we could go out and we can ask all of these 1,000 system owners that we have. And these could then be translated into, well, does this risk factor, that state that I chose, I don't have multi-factor on this system, or my monitoring level is weekly. I have weekly reports that I don't look at. Well, these states that we end up choosing in our measurements that we put up there, they can then decide whether we go up from the baseline or we go down. So it's really a nice way of you could say minimizing the workload on the people that know things about their systems, and just categorizing our measurements to say, well, this measurement, if it's yes, how does it affect my probability? Is it upwards or downwards from that baseline? And yeah, we think that is a very interesting approach, and it can save a lot of time. Now we will go into greater details on the other side of the equation with an example again, how we decompose and how we end up with these loss ranges. Take it away, Spence.
Thank you very much, Frederik. Just to add a quick note on what Frederik just talked to you about. The last thing he talked about, this is when you want to move to more advanced concepts within risk quantification. So if you are a small organization, this is not the place to start. This is sort of where you go if you have 300 or 500 separate assets that you need to aggregate some kind of risk assessment for. What I'm going to talk about now is another technique we use quite extensively to understand losses from an incident. There was a very good question in the Q&A session as to sort of Bo's description of a risk scenario. The consequence is to the asset, but this is just a way of saying the asset is impacted by this threat actor and threat event that we've talked about. When the asset is impacted, it results in consequences. And consequences in our interpretation can be loss of confidentiality, loss of integrity, or loss of availability. But the way we actually describe these losses follow a very specific structure that we've not developed ourselves. We went to the great internet to some very smart people who have developed this FAIR framework some years ago now. The FAIR framework is it's a couple of different things, but it's a risk assessment or risk analysis methodology that builds up around these quantitative risk assessments, and it presents to you some templates or some models that you can apply your risk scenarios into and use to deconstruct your risk scenarios into meaningful components. So if I ask you, how much are you going to lose from a cyber attack? That's a very wide question to answer. And what we can do instead is we can piece it, unbuild it, you could almost say, like a Lego set. If you take it apart piece by piece, you can look at each of the pieces and you can much better estimate sort of what is the level of consequence for each of these pieces. So in terms of decomposition, this is one of the cornerstones of risk management, we believe. This exercise of breaking down your challenges or your uncertainties into smaller uncertainties or smaller challenges that can more easily be measured or be estimated. So how we can take an example here just for you to go through now. If I ask you guys how many kilograms of coffee beans are consumed in Denmark each day, and remember back to Frederik's presentation, you want to give an estimate where you are 90% certain. So if I ask you for this question, you might say, okay, I want to break this down. There's 5.9, I think we're close to 6 million Danes at this point. Maybe 60 to 75% are coffee drinkers. If you say they drink 2 to 4 cups of coffee and 6 to 15 grams of beans per cup, then you've broken this down and you've implicitly made a calculation or made a formula in your head that says number of Danes times the percentage of Danes who are coffee drinkers times the number of cups times the amount of grams in each cup should give me a rough estimate. So you could take the lower estimate being 5.9 million times 60% times 2 cups times 6 grams, and you can divide it into 365. You get 42,480 kilograms. If you do the same with the upper bounds you just estimated, you get something like 265,500. And if you look at the report, it would say that it's something like 140 tons, which is 140,000 kilograms of beans consumed daily in Denmark. of course, this number, and it's the same with the Norwegian coastline example from earlier, these are also approximations. So we are just basically doing a similar exercise here to get smaller pieces that are easier for us to understand and to work with in terms of understanding the potential losses from these incidents. Now, how we do this with the open FAIR framework. The open FAIR framework is based on the FAIR framework, which was developed by Jack Jones and some others by the FAIR Institute originally. It's been adopted by the open group who also hosts the TOGAF standard, if some of you are familiar with that one. And they actually publish these standards online for everybody to use. You can go in and access them today. I would definitely recommend to read through them. And these tools made publicly available are actually, at this point, the only open source methods of their kind that are also referenced by NIST. At the moment, if you read the NIST IR 8286, they reference the open FAIR standard as an approach to risk analysis here. So this is a method that is quite widely used. I think they say it's something like 50% of Fortune 1000 organizations who use FAIR. It is also something that is being vetted quite thoroughly through this open group releasing it. So we feel quite confident in using a tool like this to decompose our loss scenarios. How the FAIR standard builds it up is you have a threat, and this is back to the scenario idea from Boat earlier. You have a threat which breach or impair a particular asset. This breach causes some consequences, which is this observable loss event. The observable loss event will have some direct consequences. So these are costs and losses directly associated with the incident. And it will have or might have some secondary losses, which is losses occurred based on people outside the actual incident reacting to you having had that incident. And we will dive into what these sort of components are. If we go into to this taxonomy I've written up here on the screen, what it basically says is we have a risk. A risk is composed of a loss event frequency, so the likelihood of an event occurring. This is what Frederik has been talking to you about. And there are some further decompositions of the loss event frequency if you want to go down into more detail or break that down even further. But you can also just remain on this upper level and just talk about sort of what is the probability of this event occurring within, let's say, the coming year. Then the other branch, which is the one I will talk to you about now, is the loss magnitude branch. This measures the size of the impact to your organization if an incident occurs. And it's measured in primary loss, which is direct consequences from the incident, and secondary risk, which is often also just referred to as secondary loss. But the reason why we call it secondary risk is because it might not be every time we have an incident that there's also going to be secondary losses. So we have a secondary loss frequency and a secondary loss magnitude. If you have a major cyber attack, one of the examples of secondary loss could be lawsuits following the release of client data. And that might not be something that would happen every time. Let's say you are in that horrible situations that you've had enough cyber attacks to actually have experienced it multiple times. It might only be 50% or 10% of the incidents where you actually had a secondary loss afterwards. So when we talk about loss magnitude, I want to sort of take an example and break it down and refer back to Frederik's discussions where he presented this 90% confidence interval. We are going to be working with the same idea in all of our estimations here. So we allow for real world events that falls outside of our own confidence level. again, accommodating some of these biases and the tendencies we humans have to not work entirely rationally with probability. So doing this, let's say we have the first part of the decomposition. We have this risk scenario, an incident where system intrusion into the CRM system through various ways results in this malicious actor getting access to data in the system, causing loss of confidentiality, integrity, or availability. So if we want to just make this an example, this could be someone who's been lurking in your system for about half a year, looking around what to exploit. They've extracted a lot of your customer data, and now they've decided to deploy ransomware, so they block your system and you cannot access any of your files. Now, the primary losses in this regard, the FAIR methodology talks about different categories of loss, and you can theoretically experience these both as primary and secondary losses. However, the main things we see in primary loss would be handling cost, it will be loss of productivity for your organization, and any kind of replacement of equipment. So if we talk about handling cost, this could be broken down to, let's say, the number of internal employees working on the incident, the duration of the incident, your internal billing rate for these people. Maybe even you have some people from outside the organization, externals working on the incident, and the duration that they will be working, and the external billing rate. And you might want to add sort of add an additional handling cost of some sort at the end. Again, this formula, you decide to calculate this formula for a minimum level with the 90% confidence and a maximum level. So you have this range. When you've decomposed these pieces down, you basically just take all of the minimum ranges, you add them together. That's your aggregate minimum range according to this function down here. You do the same with your upper ranges, and you have the upper range for handling cost. Now, you might have some productivity as well. This could be direct lost earnings. If you have a business that is a web shop, you survive by being available for clients all the time. As soon as you are offline, you start losing a certain percentage of sales. Some clients might decide to come back the day afterwards, or if you are in a very cutthroat business, they might just go to your competitor because they want this product now. Then you want to look into, if you are maybe a consultancy business or a bank or similar, you might have your productivity, your lost earnings is actually measured by how many employees do I have sitting on their hands at this point, not able to do anything. So that could be measured in number of employees affected times the duration times your internal billing rate. And then usually you would want to add some kind of percentage to this formula. That is to say, even though this incident lasted for 7 hours, it's not 7 hours of lost time for all of my employees, because some of them could do other work. Some of them decided just to go home, and they maybe worked a few hours later the day afterwards. So you can put in a rate to say maybe it's 50% or 20% of the productivity for that time period that is lost. Turns out this productivity loss actually can become very large, especially if you have a large workforce who is dependent on IT systems working. The last thing I want to put into this box of primary loss in this time around is replacement cost. So this would be if you have any kind of hardware or similar that breaks during this incident, and you need to replace a switch in your office or similar. And remember, this decomposition is useful not only for cyber attacks. It's useful for if you have a physical event where lightning strikes your office and your switchboard goes boom, or if you have an employee making a manual error causing your entire database to be deleted, and you have to recover from backup, and the backup is not all that recent, so you have a lot of cleanup work, for example. This framework for understanding losses is applicable in all of these situations. It's just a way of systematically breaking down your losses, so you can describe, as Frederik showed you much earlier in this presentation, you can describe how much of my losses are primary loss, how much of our losses are actually related to handling or to productivity or maybe to secondary losses. And suddenly you're able to say, we have incredibly high productivity loss. what can we do about this level of productivity loss? And you go in and you look at your estimates and you say, well, we have a lot of people who are completely unable to do stuff with this system offline. Is there any way we can build in some manual processes or some sort of substitute processes that can allow them maybe just to lose maybe 10% of productivity rather than 50% of productivity for this particular incident? And suddenly you have a cost benefit and a case to present to management saying, if we can reduce with this extra system our losses from such an event in terms of productivity by 40%, we expect to have this level of saving. And then you can compare it to the likelihood of the event occurring, and you can start to do basic mathematics, say, well, we're going to save 100,000 euros, and it's going to cost us 20 or 30,000 euros to implement this new system, rather than going to your boss and saying, I want to implement this system for 30,000 euros to ensure redundancy in our infrastructure. That's two very different cases when you have to present them to your director. Okay, secondary losses. This is where it becomes a bit more fluffy, but our clear argument throughout this is every kind of loss can be quantified. This also includes secondary losses, being, for example, competitive advantage, being reputational losses, being any response cost related to these consequences in your secondary losses, being maybe fines and judgments following an incident like a data breach or similar. These might not be the areas you find easiest to quantify in the beginning, but think about what you do today in terms of understanding the risk of these events. Most likely you already today in your head make some kind of mental model about how does our risk to reputation compare against our risk to operational budget. You make this model in your mind today already. We just want to put it down on paper. And this is not going to be a perfect model. Back to Bo's comment, it's going to be all models are wrong, but we want to make models that make us less wrong over time. And this can be very simple models, as you just saw with primary loss. In terms of reputation, this can be how many customers do we expect to leave our organization based on this incident, a range of this, and how much is our annual earnings per customer. Then you have a rough estimate for this. And again, if you have the right sufficiently large intervals, you also make sure that the model in the end will take into account these incidents where suddenly we could not have foreseen this billion-dollar incident that lasted us a year and a half because they hit us just when we were testing our power supply unit in our data center. So we only had one power supply, and suddenly all the electricity was lost and they forgot to back up the day before. And all of these, it just happened this way accidentally, which is why we cannot recover. So you still have these extreme events included in your model with your 90% confidence estimates. All right. I just want to sum up this brief walk into decomposition of scenarios. I hope it makes sense to you at least that deconstructing a loss event into smaller pieces allows you to much better estimate each of these pieces. And it also is the first step towards being able to actually mitigate based on your estimated losses from particular events. The FAIR framework is only one approach. You can use your own approach, homemade as well. Why we recommend you start off with the FAIR model is because you come into a community where you have the same language as many other risk experts across the world. So when you talk about subject matter experts or secondary risk or primary risk, you start to have a language that is actually comparable across organizations. There are a lot of different ways and different finer details to decompose risk, and it's also, in our view, a way or a question of starting off a place. The first year, you're not maybe going to have the most perfect quantitative risk assessment, but you're going to have some kind of estimate of where you want to end up. And this estimate is going to be extremely useful for next year when you then have sort of fine-tuned your model. You might say, well, it doesn't make sense for us to look at this because this really doesn't matter for our losses. It's a non-issue, you could say, but we have very large estimated losses or very wide ranges on another area like secondary loss reputation. Then maybe the goal for next year is to be better at estimating reputational loss. So we dive in, we might do a market analysis, how much is our customers actually worth to us, how many would actually shift, and so on. And that way we can start within the same framework to qualify our, and that's not a pun, unfortunately, or excuse me for that, but you want to qualify your your estimates in each of these areas to become more precise while maintaining accuracy. So just a final note before leaving it to Bo to summarize what we've talked about today and open up the discussion with the rest of you guys. If you are a public service provider, you might want to study secondary loss in other terms. And we've had experiences where we have studied secondary loss in terms of our clients, how much loss do they experience from their customers during an event. That might be a secondary loss for this organization that manages systems for an entire sector, but you want to understand not only what are the monetary losses to us ourselves, but also maybe more curious about how does any loss event impact our customers' profits and revenue. And again, I think I mentioned it in one of the Q&A answers also, you don't have to measure in monetary value. You can also choose, I would not recommend it immediately, but you can choose to measure different things. If you are in the health sector, you might want to measure in terms of risk to people's health. But just to make it very clear, the reason we measure in monetary value is just it's a very simple measure to work with. And in order to compare risks across the spectrum, you want to measure in the same value. That will require you to employ some of your already existing mental models, but put them down on paper. Say, we interpret reputational risk as this, and then build this into your model. And then you can adjust your assumptions as you go based on the experience you have with the model, how consistent your outputs are over time, for example. All right. This is enough rambling for me. I will hand it back to Bo to finish off this presentation and open up the floor for all of your questions.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Spence. So my first observation here is that it has been quite a lot of information. I think you all agree to that. So my question is, are you all okay out there? Is anybody still okay? Good. Everybody's, some of at least are all good. It's nice to hear. We do fully understand that there has been a lot of information, and we are planning to do a series of these seminars in the future where we maybe go a little deeper into a smaller segment of this. If you're interested in that, then just follow our LinkedIn profile. We will be very happy to share our experience with you and also show you some of the tools that we are using to make this all work. What did we cover today? Well, the first part we talked about the flaws of qualitative models, and we do believe that the quantitative models do outperform the qualitative models. And if you look over time, those using data-driven, evidence-based models like the quantitative ones, they will outperform the qualitative models by producing better decisions. If you are only doing risk management for the sake of compliance, and that is to get a clean sheet from your auditor or the government or whatever, the authorities, then you can apply methods that they accept. And they do accept qualitative models. So be happy to do that. If you, however, are a bit more offensive and you actually do want to use your risk management to make decision support, then you will look for the models that work, that has no built-in flaws, that are able to express the level of uncertainty that the future holds, and look at the future with a bit more resolution than these red, yellow, green models do carry on. We have then looked at some of the quantitative methods. We have looked at how to build good risk scenarios. You remember they have to have 4 components. We have talked about how to give good estimates. Frederick has talked about the 90% confidence intervals. This is the how tall am I kind of exercise. The Norwegian coastline, you all remember that. That is to give good ranges and to calibrate your experts before they give ranges. You have to do that. If not, you will have some of the psychological biases or problems that Malte talked about. Then Frederick, he had a lecture on Monte Carlo simulations. I hope you liked that one. It was probably the most technical part of the presentation, but he talked about some Monte Carlo simulation and how that is used. And no, it's not a very difficult tool to use. It is in 1.4 billion. It has 1.4 billion applications all over the world because Excel has it. So if you have Excel, you can do Monte Carlo simulations right away. Then we saw from Mads how we can reduce uncertainty with measurements. So if you just add information, like Mads told us, we will be able to shrink our intervals and thereby be more accurate and also in the future more precise. Then we've talked about how to measure, how to give estimates on the likelihood of cyber attacks. We've talked about Laplace rule of succession. And we've also talked about how to use public statistics to get more information on these things. There is a lot of templates. There's a lot of things that we haven't covered in this. So if you're interested, you just reach out to us, and we will help you to get onto this journey here. We believe it's the only way to do it. So the more of you that is taking up the torch here, the better for the world, the less loss events, and better and more secure organizations out there. You have more data than you think, and you need less data than you think. There is some good open taxonomies out there, like the FAIR taxonomy. Look at that, and you will be on your way. That's it for me now. I think we can take some questions, and I will give it back to you, Spence, if you will take us through this Q&A.
Yes, thank you very much, Bo. So just to let you all know, right now we have opened for questions from all of you folks. You can ask them in the Q&A session, you can ask them in the chat feature, or you can raise your hand if you want to ask the question verbally. Do remember we are recording this session and it will be made available afterwards for those of you who want to review it again. Let's start off while some of you formulate your questions, some of the questions that have arisen. First question, I think, is for Bo. Have we implemented this approach regularly with clients? What were the challenges?
Yeah, I'm unmuted now. So yeah, the answer is yes, we've done that. That is what we do, and that is what pays our salary every month. So yes, we do that every day, every month, every year, and we do it for more than 30% of the Danish financial sector. We do it for large industry corporations in Europe. We do it for energy sector. We do it for food and beverages. So yes, we do it. Second question, what are the challenges? Yes, there are challenges, especially when you are moving from one framework. That could be the qualitative. I mean, everybody has that and has tried that. And then it's about adopting or adding more quality to your process on your way. And that we believe that some of our clients have asked to just move in one go. They basically throw away what they've done so far, and then they start all over. That's one approach. But you can also take what you're doing today and add more quantification to it. And what Spence was talking about and what Frederick was talking about, how to add quality to your estimates, could be something that you apply for your current methods, right? So there is challenges in moving from one model to another. There can be some training to your board of directors that they are used to see this heat map with balls in it. How do they then appreciate when you are giving them numbers and stuff like that? But we have overcome those challenges. I don't know. I think that's my answer to the question.
Very good. Thank you, Bo. And maybe also to add to this question, very good question, that doing risk quantification sort of all in is not it's not a sprint. It is a marathon. It is not a project. It is something you implement, and you need this commitment to work with risk in this way. If risk is just a compliance exercise, this might not be the place to start, because the quantification of risk, of course, makes the most sense if you actually want to work with your risk. So there is another good question. I think I will put this over to Frederik. It is a question from Jonas asking, I struggle. Just a second, there is some. All right. I struggle to understand if the FAIR model is applied to deep dive single risk scenarios or all relevant risk scenarios to get a consolidated view. Also, what is a good time horizon? Frederik, take it away.
Yes, thank you for your excellent question, Jonas. I can understand that you think that that FAIR in this webinar we have been focusing a lot on single scenarios, and we have been spending a lot of time on decomposing those scenarios. But to make it clear, we can use the same approach on a consolidated view as well. So the model doesn't really care if we go into the deep dives. We will spend maybe more time on our measurements in those to get better precision, meaning that we will be able to narrow our ranges more. But we can do the same on a consolidated view for all, and that's what we do. We have these exhaustive lists of risk scenarios that take out all the space in our you could say the future of events, and we put them into scenarios, and we decompose them in a meaningful manner as to not use too much time on estimating each scenario, and then we end up with the loss exceedance curve for the full deal. But you can also slice the data into different kind of threats if you want to look at the risk for different kind of threats or different kind of assets. So that is doable as well. And you also asked about the time horizon, and I think you, Spence, you touched upon that, saying it's a marathon to get this process really entrenched in your organization. It starts with building better risk scenarios, these things that we have been talking about today, really understanding what are we measuring, and then go from there. But there are some very entry level models that you can use in built Excel as well.
Very well, thank you very much, Frederik. And also in terms of time horizon, for if you would say one risk assessment, going through an entire risk register of the potential outcomes for the coming year for a small or medium-sized business, this will be a 3-week project usually for us, 3 or 4 weeks. So while we say the implementation of risk quantification is a marathon, that's more in terms of getting this mindset about how we understand risk in different ways. There was a question regarding risk appetite. There's different ways of interpreting risk appetite and risk acceptance when you do a quantitative risk, because the understandings of inherent and current and residual risk is different, because you don't lose detail in the quantitative risk assessments. We've written some articles on this also in our website. In regards to let's jump to the next. There are some 2 good questions here. 2 questions about loss exceedance graphs. I think they are very good for Frederik to answer. Do you have an approach to enrich loss exceedance graphs with colors to increase acceptance for audience who are more familiar with heat maps? First question.
And yes, if you know what you mean by a red event in terms of money, then you can color that part of the graph. But what you will miss there is the probability aspect of it. So it's am I losing this kind of money yearly, or is it by a 5% chance? And this is where things like risk appetite is really useful at looking at, asking questions like, how much am I willing to lose with a 5% chance yearly? How much am I willing to lose with a 30% chance? But yes, all of these scenarios that we have been estimating, you can actually translate them back into one single number. What would that be? Well, it could, if you want to look at extreme events, it could be the fractals out in the tail events, the extremes. But it could also be things like averages. You could use the averages for each of these events, and you could plug the average into a color. But what we, and as Spence, he said, we're not losing the details here. We're keeping the details, but then we are simplifying it in showing a single number later on. But we can go back into the scenario and understand it way much better than we would if it was one single number. And then there was a second question on that one. Maybe Bo, you can answer to this one. Can you give an example of how loss exceedance graphs can help management to make better decisions on investing for the one or the other or other controls?
Yeah, good question. Just to elaborate further on the question before, because I think this is very important. We have all, or many of us, have been using and communicating risk from a heat map. Okay, and how do one make that more quantifiable? How can we do that? And as Frederick was talking about, we could decide what is the ball in the heat map representing from our loss exceedance curves. I heard from Frederick that could be an approach that we were talking about the 95% fractile or something like that. That is the one that we plug into the heat map to communicate in a more simple way. Then when you click on that ball, maybe you could open a view showing all the details behind that ball, right? That could be an approach that people could see it, make a quick orientation on where do we have risk, and then they could click the ball and they could see more information. That could be an approach. We've seen that being used. And the other question was, how can we use the loss exceedance curve for decision making? Well, risk appetite could be one thing that we could implement. So if you, I don't know if you have that line, Frederick, where we have a line actually where we can show this is your risk appetite, and we can see if the loss exceedance curves exceeds the risk appetite. If there is anything on the right side of the risk appetite curve, that could be a way to discuss whether the extreme events is unacceptable or whether the low to moderate loss events are maybe too likely or whatever happens. So that could be one thing to start a good discussion in your board or together with your management.
Very good. Thank you very much, Bo. I want to quickly grab one of the most recent questions that came in, and that is from Christoph asking, is it possible to categorize scenarios to get a high-level summary? And I'll just answer this quickly. Yes. This is what we do when we do our risk assessments. We have something like maybe 45 scenarios, but these 45 scenarios are within our risk taxonomy, which is basically, imagine a tree structure. So we have, in our case, we have usually 5 categories of risk under which you have a series of risk scenarios that are more specific. So we can report risk as an aggregate of all of these areas just in one graph. We can report it as risks within these 5 categories, or we can report on it as individual risk scenarios for perhaps for a deep dive analysis. So definitely you can do this. And that's the great thing about quantitative risk assessment. You have this transparency all the way through, so you can go back and you can modulate your data in a way that you can present it. I think there was also a question earlier about sort of how do I describe this at a team level versus at a management level. And this is the good thing about risk quantification. If you have a good taxonomy, like the FAIR taxonomy, if you have a good threat taxonomy as well, it doesn't matter where you sort of choose to look at it. If you look from the helicopter, it's just going to look like one big blob, but if you zoom in, it might be a million different things. You can do this with the quantitative risk assessment as long as you follow a taxonomy that makes it clear what you're looking at. All right. There's a question here from Anders to how to handle other risk types than the ones with a financial loss. For example, reputational risks that may be very low financial loss, but very high on reputational risk. It may be highly likely. Would you assess this risk as low then? And maybe Bo, you want to answer that question?
I think I will give it to Frederick if he can take it.
Yeah, that's fine.
Especially reputation loss. How do we measure?
Yeah. So what I would say is if it matters to you, then you can measure it, right? And I would ask the question, how does it look if reputation is something that is important for you? How does it look when you have less of reputation? Isn't that measurable in some monetary value eventually? If it isn't measurable in monetary value, then how can it be important to you? Like I'm asking as an organization, right? Money is what is important to organizations. Even things like human lives are being monetized when governments have to make decisions on what to initiate, what projects to initiate. They monetize human lives. So everything that is important to you can be measured. And asking the question, how does it look when I have less reputation? How does that look to me? What happens in that event? Well, is there anything that is in that event that I can measure? That would be how I would go about it.
And it could be to follow up on that. That could be business that you were expecting to come your way that didn't come your way because you have less reputation. So you could quantify that business that did not end on your account, right? Or it could be business that you have today that leaves your business. Okay, so they look at your reputation and they say, okay, I don't like this company anymore because they are frequently attacked by cyber events. So I don't want to do business with this company anymore because I'm afraid of my personal data. So I leave that engagement, so to speak. So that would be a way to, like Frederick says, to see that you have less reputation. You have less business.
Yeah. Thank you very much, both Bo and Frederik. And to add a single note or a final note on this, also estimating risk types that if you are, I touched briefly on it earlier, if you are a public organization, you might say, well, what is the risk of the public losing trust in our ability to deliver services, and how does this materialize in terms of sort of a visible loss to us? And of course, now you are out in some of the ranges that require translation in order to be applied in this model. And I think I briefly touched on it earlier that yes, you can use different measures, but the challenge is as soon as you use different methods of measuring risk, you have two different buckets that you cannot compare unless you make a model to compare them. So you can decide to study risk of, for example, people losing trust in your organization as a public organization. But at some point, if you want to compare to the rest of your risk, you want to convert your risk to one single measure that you can compare across, and that requires a model. And this model might be wrong. It probably is to some extent. But this is one of the things you then do over time. You fine tune this model. Is it realistic? You might have two different models, one that is conservative, one that is optimistic, and you might want to run them against each other. But this is where you start to experiment with your risk quantification as well. I hope that answered most of the question there. So there was a question here. Could you give a range on how long time you spend with a company in order to apply your risk model? And I think I answered this briefly earlier. For a small, medium business, this would be something like a 3 or 4 week period to do a complete IT risk assessment. And to answer your second question as well, how many cyber risk scenarios do we usually work with? It tends to land somewhere in the range of 35 to 45 risk scenarios across these 5 scenario or risk categories. And this is also when I talk to people in the industry, it tends to be a similar number they land on, and I suspect it has something to do with our ability to grasp much more than 45 scenarios in an Excel sheet or in our minds at a given time. But there is really no limit. And the point Frederik, I think, was making earlier about having a structured risk taxonomy means I could look at 5 risk scenarios, or I could look at 45 risk scenarios. If they are part of the same structure, the same tree, I can decide to look at a very overall risk scenario, a very generalized risk scenario on one side, and some more detailed ones on the other side. But if I want to report on it, I can still just aggregate it up and compare it on the same levels. So I can do a very detailed risk analysis into cyber because I'm very scared about that, and I'm very uncertain about that. And I might have a much more generalized loss expectancy for major internal errors, because unfortunately we experience this every year or every other year of some magnitude. But I can still compare them at the same level. I just know I have a lot more sort of routes to the one risk scenario than I have to the other risk scenario. Okay, I hope this was good enough questions for you, Malene. And we answered also this one about the high-level summary, I think. Are there any questions we've not responded to, or anyone who've had a question since then who would like to have it answered now? Give it a minute or two. Otherwise, I think what will then be left to say is thank you very, very much for spending your afternoon with us. We hope you found it useful. And of course, when you receive this recording, feel free to share it with your colleagues as well. If you know your good colleagues within IT risk management or IT security who might get something useful out of this. I don't know, Bo, if you have some amazing final words to say now that the Q&A has died off.
Well, thank you. As just wanted to repeat, thank you for spending time with us. If anybody wants to have material, written material, please reach out. If anybody out there wants to talk to our experts, then please reach out. And if you just want to continue the dialogue with us, then it could be these seminars that we would probably run every 3 months or something like that. And we will also try to go into detail on some of the elements that we've talked about and also repeat some of the elements that we've talked about. So it could be that you wanted some of your colleagues to join the next one. Then you will find something that we already covered in this one, and then we will maybe deep dive into some areas apart from that. So if you fancy that idea, we will continue to do this public domain.